very much, and I definitely will hold you to that point, Kev. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully you can all see this now. But this is a really interesting question to explore, and I'm going to start with a few caveats. Let's assume that we're all happy with the idea that youth work is a form of non-formal education. And I know that that can be debated a bit, but in the context of human rights, it's not the healthcare system, it's not the judicial system, it's more or less where it fits. And also, I want to be clear, I'm not a human rights lawyer, I'm an advocate for youth work. I've been a youth worker all of my life, and what I'm doing here is trying to dream big about how we could use the right to education to advocate for youth work, really. Most of the content I'm going to give you comes from a piece of work I've been doing for the Council of Europe's Education Department on a course called Education as a Human Right, which is about these interpretations of the European Conventions of Human Rights and what that means for educational professionals. If you want to check some of that out, just search Council of Europe and Lemon and you'll find it. And for those of you that don't know, the Council of Europe, it's the largest human rights organisation on the continent. It's not an EU institution. We're still part of it despite Brexit. And it's an intergovernmental organisation. It's kind of like a club for its member states where they come together and set international legislation and international recommendations. And one of the most important ones things that it oversees is the European Convention of Human Rights. And that protects all the human rights of all people in all the countries that belong to the Council of Europe, which we do. And human rights are the basic rights and freedoms that apply to every person. And the right to education is one of those human rights. So no matter what citizenship you have, whatever your background, if you're in a Council of Europe country, the European Convention of Human Rights protects your right to education. Now, it's worth saying it's part of a wide range of international legislation, not least the UNCRC and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. What's unique about the European Convention of Human Rights, or maybe not unique, but particularly important about it, is that there's an international court that oversees it. That's part of the Council of Europe. And cases can be brought directly to that court by any individual in a Council of Europe state if they think the state has breached their rights. And so if your country isn't upholding your human rights to education, you can apply to this court for a hearing there. And the UK has had quite a lot of key cases brought against it around what the right to education includes. And so what that means is there's a whole set of case law that starts to define what the right to education is and what's included in it. And that defines what Council of Europe member states, like the United Kingdom, are expected to do under that right. It's worth mentioning the UNCRC here. I mean, Scotland's on its process to thinking about that and incorporating that in national law. So it's possible you might see much more stronger tools in your national court for bringing cases about the right to education as well. But for the purposes of this presentation, what I'm talking about is exclusively how the rights interpreted by the European Court of Human Rights and under this convention. So let's look at what the content of it is. It's Article 2, Protocol number 1 of the ECHR, and it's got two halves to it. The first part says no person shall be denied to the right to education. And the second part, I'm not going to read out because it's actually not very important to what we're talking about. The second part is basically the bit that allows your parents to opt you out of sexual and religious health education. So important, but not so relevant to our purposes. So the right itself is very simple. No person shall be denied the right to education. But through the various pieces of case law, you can think about it's been established what's actually included in that right and what it covers. And what it means is that any person within a state's territory should have access to the education that's offered. So that's very much about non-discrimination and preventing people being unfairly denied the right to education because of things like ethnicity or citizenship. And it applies to all forms and levels of education. So it's not just about formal education in schools or primary and secondary schools, but every type of education. It applies to children and it applies to adults. And it applies to teaching and instruction as well as the other things that happen in educational institutions. So not just what's on the national curriculum, but everything that it does. But let's go a little bit further. What's not specified by this right? Well, the smartest amongst you will have spotted that it doesn't say you have the right to access youth work. It doesn't actually say anything about what sorts of education young people should have. It doesn't specify the right to access physics lessons or maths lessons or English lessons, because it's written in the negative. No person shall be denied the right. It doesn't say young people shall have this, young people shall have that. And so that's a bit of a weakness. Sometimes I hear youth workers claiming there's a right to education, and there isn't anything specifically in the European Convention of Human Rights that specifies that. And the reason for that, and the reason why no types of education are specified, is educational systems are always limited by state resources. And it's up to a state to decide what type or level of education they want to offer and what sort of education system they want to create. So if you're in a very poor country, perhaps somewhere in the global south, you might not be able to provide even higher education for everyone. But if you're in one of the richest economies in the world, like we are, you can clearly provide a lot more of that. And the idea is that states should be progressing towards a quality education, and defining what quality education looks like is an ongoing process that links to a whole set of recommendations that the Council of Europe has. And so the right to education is about making sure that whatever education is on offer, no one in the state can be denied accessing to it. And so that's quite an important point. There's not necessarily a clearly defined piece that says youth work should be part of the right to education, or that young people have the right to youth work. But, and this is a very big but, if we start to dream big, it also doesn't rule out youth work being part of the right to education. Remember, this applies to all forms and all types of education. So if youth work is part of a state's educational offer, and what I mean by that is not, is youth work happening in schools, but if we consider that youth work is something that a state is doing and that it's part of the broader educational offer that it makes to the people in its state, then you can start to argue no young people should be denied the right to access that youth work. Maybe you've got a national youth strategy that sets out all young people should have access to universal provision. And you can start to argue then that there's a duty through the right to education to make sure no young people are denied that. Because the right to education, particularly the way it interacts with the rights to non-discrimination, become very important. But there are a few more ifs and buts to talk about. The case law states pretty clearly that states can't provide education in a way that discriminates people's access to it without a legitimate aim. And what does that mean? Well, to give you an example, it would be legitimate for you to prevent adults accessing youth projects on the basis it's a form of education intended for young people. And that's the same way you wouldn't let a 35-year-old go to a primary school. That's a legitimate aim. You can discriminate against older people in the population because this provision is intended for a certain group in a legitimate way. But what if your universal youth work provision is just a bit patchy? Maybe you go to Edinburgh and there's loads of universal provision, but you go to Glasgow and there's not really anything there. Well, you could start to argue then that young people in Glasgow are being denied the right to access education and youth work because there's no legitimate reason why another group of people should have it and that they shouldn't. What if you're in a local authority and the youth work offer doesn't include anything that's accessible to disabled young people? There's no youth work on offer that meets their accessibility needs. Then you could argue then that disabled young people are being denied the right to education because of that. And based on the case law, it's not automatic that every piece of youth provision needs to be accessible to every single young person. The states can use the resources the best way you see fit. So, for example, the way we might create special educational schools, we might have dedicated projects that can meet the needs of disabled young people. But disabled young people would have the right to access something if other young people are getting something. And if there's nothing on offer, then you could argue they're being denied that right. When you get to the case of targeted youth work, you could be slightly different here. A state could probably do something like say, all of our youth work is for young people who are NEET. The purpose of our youth work policy is about getting people into education and work. So we focus all of our youth work resources on young people who are NEET. And I wouldn't agree with that as a youth work approach, but it wouldn't be a breach of the right to education, I don't think, because there's a fairly legitimate aim behind that. So let's swing back to the original question then. Does the right to education include a right to youth work? It's a kind of no, but yes, but question. Youth work's not explicitly mandated in the right to education, but it's not excluded either. So a country can just have no youth work, and that wouldn't be a breach of young people's human rights. They could focus all of their resources on STEM subjects or formal education, and that could be their policy. But if you're in a country that is offering youth work in a substantial and meaningful way, no young person should be denied the right to access it, and unless there's a legitimate aim for denying them that right. Now, I want to be clear here. I'm kind of thinking big and dreaming. I'm not going to lie to you. Most of what the international text and legislation about the right to education focuses on formal education. They tend to talk about schools mainly, and then it says, oh, and by the way, this applies to lifelong learning and a non-formal education as well. But I do think there are avenues where we can begin to use the right to education to advocate for a more extensive youth work system. Scotland's got some pretty advanced youth work. It's one of the more extensive youth work systems in the country, systems in Europe. And maybe it's advanced enough you can say, well, actually, there is an intention for a widespread universal offer. And we need to use the right to education to advocate for making sure that those who are left out currently get access to that. And maybe that starts to give you some arguments as people who want to advocate for youth work to highlight why this is so important that we have this equitable access. Maybe if you're really feeling particularly aggressive in your advocacy work, you could even think about launching strategic cases in the European Court of Human Rights or other courts to try and solidify that as part of that right. Or perhaps more interestingly, explore how we can embed youth work within the rights of the UNCRC as that comes in at national level. There's a lot of risks here. I can't do this presentation without mentioning the things that the UK government is doing at the moment around human rights at national level are very, very damaging for people's human rights. And they're essentially part of a political move to pull us out from the European Convention of Human Rights from some parties. And so one of the things we can be doing at the moment is advocating for human rights more generally and advocating for youth work as part of the right to education. So that's pretty much my answer to this question. Does the right to education include youth work? I think we can make the case that we can, but it's certainly not clear that it's definitely there. I think if we're serious about advocating for young people's rights, we should be advocating for them all and advocating for young people's rights in general and the way that youth work supports that. I hope that's been useful to you. Again, I'm not a lawyer and I'm definitely pushing things here to find ways we can make the case for youth work. But that's very much what I was trained to do as a youth worker. Thank you very much.